I'm Metta Spencer, and tonight I get to talk to two friends about very serious matters, and at least I consider it very serious matters. Climate change, and I think that the melting of the permafrost in the Arctic is something that we have to all pay a whole lot of attention to and worry a little bit about, because it's pretty ominous as I read the news of the day. So I have been troubled by some of the findings that I've come across in the press, and especially having to do with the planting of trees in the Arctic. And so I got in touch with my friend Robin Collins, who is in Ottawa, and who will say hi. Robin?
Hello. Hello, Metta. Hello, David.
And he did a little searching and got in touch with the people in Geneva, no, rather Zurich, who are doing the kind of work that bothered me. But we did get them on this program. And he then did a little bit more research and came up with David T. Price, who is now in Edmonton. Say hello, David.
Hello, Metta. Hello, Robin.
Very good. David has just retired from a position in the Natural Resources Canada. I guess you were originally a forester. Now you call yourself a general scientist or something like that.
No. I would say I'm quite explicit. I am a forest ecosystem modeler.
Wonderful. All right.
Well, with a whole range of disciplines sort of that feed into that.
Okay, good. Well, a modeler has to know what it is he's plugging into his model, which means you need to know what the meanings of these various terms are that I don't fully understand. So let's start at the top about the kinds of things that worried me. There's a lab in Zurich, Switzerland, headed by a man named Crowther, which seems to have about 150 people on every article that they publish.
Yes.
But they did a couple of things very interesting. One was a few years ago, they counted the number of trees in the world and estimated that there are about 3 trillion of them. And then more recently, they took, I guess, photos of about 80,000 little plots of land around the world, and did their analysis of what kinds of things grow there on each of them, and then inferred from the findings where it might be possible to raise trees that do not have trees, but which otherwise the soil is very similar to the places that do have trees. Therefore, the reason for doing this is that we now have to seriously remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, other greenhouse gases, but mostly any kind of carbon. We can't wait long enough to bring our emissions down in terms of our current reduction of emissions of greenhouse gas. We have to actually remove carbon from the atmosphere that we've already put into the atmosphere. And the best way of doing that, according to most people nowadays, is by use of trees. If we have 3 trillion trees now, the estimate is that if we had 1 more trillion good trees, that they would remove enough of the carbon from the atmosphere to compensate for about 2/3 of the mess we've already made. Is that right, David? Am I misstating that?
At that point, on that, those details, I would have to go back and look at the paper in more carefully.
Well, I think that's what they say. That
I would believe it with a whole bunch of caveats.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I've heard that we can do 2/3 of the job of cleaning it up if we plant a lot of trees and if they grow well and we take care of them and all of that. So the important thing then is to plant trees fast and let them grow as quickly as possible, and plant the right ones and make sure they don't die and things like that, so that as urgently as possible we create another about 1 billion more hectares of forest than exists now. And we are assured by this particular article, these researchers in Zurich, that this is possible. And they've done this by looking at making their maps of where the soil could support more forests. And they're not saying that's where you want to plant forests. That's exactly what they claim they have not said, because that's how we all read it. First thing we do is reading it and say, well, they're telling us that's where we want to plant our forest. But they say, no, we just said that's where they will grow. And that is kind of a weasel term, because it allows them to say, we didn't advise you to make this mess that you're claiming is going to occur if you do what we tell you to do. Okay? All right, so we have to plant another 1 billion or so hectares of forests and keep them alive enough to sequester a lot of carbon. And the question is where to do it. And they gave us maps of where to put it, which bothered me because I'd already read up on enough material to realize that people are saying don't plant trees in the Arctic. That's not a good place because the trees will actually warm the soil, rather warm the whole environment, the world, more than they sequester carbon. So I took this up with Robin, who is much better at arithmetic than I am, and asked him to do some calculations. So Robin, why don't you tell us it from your point of view, whether we agree and why you think that I don't really have to worry about these forests that are either going to grow on their own in the Arctic or unwisely going to be planted in the Arctic.
I wouldn't say you don't have to worry. What I would say is I think what the Zurich team, Crowther and Bastan and the others, what they were trying to pull together was what the potential capacity of the Earth was for tree growing, notwithstanding that not every place is a good place to grow trees. So they were trying to start off the conversation with how large an area is available to plant, and I think they're estimating there could be potentially 4 trillion trees, the 3 trillion in existence and another trillion needed to reduce carbon dioxide by a significant percentage. That's just, they're giving us a ballpark to begin with. And they're not saying that this is how you're going to solve global warming and climate change. They're saying, put this into your calculations.
The IPCC suggested a year ago, we have 12 years into which to clean it up. Is that true? And should we count on forestry as a major way of doing it? And if so, do we have to worry about where to plant the trees and whether the Arctic is a good place or not?
So I've been working in this area. I mean, when I first started working for the Canadian Forest Service, it was specifically on carbon cycling in Canada's forests, and we were working as a team to answer questions like whether Canada's forests were actually a carbon sink or a source, and how one might manage that resource to be a stronger sink or to turn it from being a source into a sink, and what are the constraints on this. And there are numerous natural processes that interfere with any specific management objective, and you have to take those into account. And then we have to think about how we manage our forests today and what we do with them. So we immediately, I think, recognized at that time, this is going back to the mid-1990s, the importance of forestry for the purposes of growing timber. And that timber that is harvested ends up being its own carbon sink. And in fact, if the carbon, in order to make forests a carbon sink, we can let them sit in the woods, at which point they will accumulate carbon. And if we had been deforesting Canada extensively and we allowed those trees to reestablish, that in itself would create a carbon sink. But the reality is that Canada is not horribly deforested. We have not lost a huge portion of our natural tree cover since European settlement. And if you thought about all of the forests in Canada, all of the forests in the world, in the absence of human interference, then averaged over the long time, over multiple years, over a large area, the net carbon uptake by this system would be basically zero. Because for every tree that's growing in one part of the forest, there are other trees that are dying. There are trees that are dropping branches, dropping leaves. They all turn over their roots. And gradually they accumulate all this dead material, which then is decomposed. So some of it is due to the plants themselves respiring, and some of it is due to all the herbivores and other organisms that are munching away on the dead material, releasing carbon dioxide. They're all doing their thing. They're all producing carbon dioxide. And it works out to be pretty much a zero-sum balance. Now, when humans come in, we start messing things up. But one of the good things we are doing is that we want to harvest these trees as a resource. So long as we manage the forest sustainably. And of course, that does cover a multitude of questions. But actually, I believe that sustainable forestry is something that Canada is actually pretty good at. There's a very solid scientific underpinning for forest practices in Canada. It's been implemented for decades, and there's always that. It's a continual learning experience, and we have this commitment to sustainable forest management in Canada. Not necessarily the case in other parts of the world, and we aim not to harvest more than we can sustainably regrow, and regeneration is critically important. So we do plant millions of trees, and when Trudeau says we'll plant 1 billion trees, really, he's not saying very much, because if you look at the statistics, we already plant about 500 million trees a year in any case. So in 2 years, he's made his commitment. But at the same time, when we do this, and that half billion trees per year should be sufficient to regenerate something like, again, typically you can think of 1,000 trees per hectare. You may plant more than 1,000 seedlings per hectare to try to achieve a stand density of 1,000 per hectare at what we call free to grow status. And as the stand gets older and older, some of the trees die, as is a natural process. So by the time you get to a harvestable stand, there may only be a couple of hundred trees per hectare standing.
Can I ask a couple of questions?
Yeah, sure.
Are you saying that there's an ideal point at which you would harvest the trees, in other words, for the wood,
yes,
and then replant? And
yes.
if you pass that point, then you're moving towards either the carbon neutral position, or those trees you don't cut will be net producers of carbon dioxide. So it's really finding that time to cut them. How much more space is there that could be planted, would you say?
Well, in Canada, unless you really start thinking about afforesting cropland or afforesting north of tree line or above tree line in mountainous areas, there isn't really very much. Presumably the cropland should be kept under crops. Clearly it will grow trees. In some cases, cropland was carrying forest cover when it was cleared of trees. But in the prairies, for example, which are really highly productive soils, you could probably grow trees, except that people have done surveys of this, done analyses, and in general, the prairies are probably too hot and too dry to support sustained forest growth. The problem is going to be in the other parts of the country. At least right now, most of these areas are either too cold. So if you go further north, you get into climate constraints. And of course, with global warming and Canada's north potentially warming 2 or 3 times faster than the global average, it won't take that long for conditions to improve to the point where you can grow fairly decent trees. And that is part of the concern and part of the reality of the likely and actual observed expansion northward of trees basically seeding into the tundra. But in terms of land available, I don't know that there's very much land that we haven't already occupied.
The Crowder people say that of this 1 billion additional hectares of the added forest, not just maintaining forest replacing the ones that we cut down, but adding forestry.
Mm-hmm.
We most of it's going to be in Russia, the U.S., meaning Alaska, and Canada, and I figured if we didn't plant if we tell them no, do not plant in the tundra of the Arctic because that's a bad idea, which they actually understand.
Yep.
Then there's not much left. There are very few places in Canada where you could plant additional trees.
I think that's true.
Robin says no. They're only talking about 50 million hectares, and you could take that out, and we'll still find that's not very much.
That's globally.
So, yeah, show us that thing.
Yeah. Can you see it now?
We've been arguing about what this means, and I don't know whether you can see this table or not.
I can.
David,
Okay.
but here we have his estimate is how much tundra there is in the biome. Will you explain it, Rob?
Right. So I'll draw around it. So depending on whether you look at, depending on which numbers you look at, I'm going to work with the potential canopy numbers. So this is the Best and Crowther paper. They estimate the tundra takes up about 50 million hectares worldwide.
Right.
And that's from a total of, this is their 900 or, one billion hectares.
Well, I'll call it 900 million.
Right, let's call it 900. So the tundra takes up, in other words, about 5.5% if we use this set of numbers. Now, the boreal forest, for which there is some permafrost as well, right?
Yep.
Is 178. So if you say,
Okay.
let's eliminate the problem, these most problematic areas, then you're eliminating, 225 of 900.
Yeah, but in Canada.
Right. So how much of it is in Canada? So let me can I flip to a map here?
Sure.
I'm gonna stop this one and try and grab.
He just thinks that if you take that 50 million hectares out, don't worry about it. We've got enough leeway, we can make up for it elsewhere. And I think that they're counting on a lot more than 50 million hectares of new forests in Canada or in the world. A lot of which will have to be in the tundra of Canadian Arctic and Russia and Alaska. What do you think, David? Is there any place else to put these trees?
Yes. Well, and with a caveat, the only place that I can think of would be forest land. And you have to recognize that within the boreal, we have fire basically taking out maybe 1 million, 2 million hectares a year on average. And not all of that is planted. In many cases, that land is assumed to be regenerating naturally, and is because it's a natural occurrence. There's often no commitment on the part of the landowner, which is essentially the crown, to regenerate it. If the individual FMA, the forest management company, is wanting to regenerate it, they may be some deal done with the province or territory to do that. But a lot of those fire areas are basically being left to their own devices. Mm-hmm. And I don't know what the total area of burned area is right now that is not regenerating satisfactorily, but it's probably in the hundreds of thousands of hectares, if not millions of hectares.
My impression is that they're not talking about reforestation. They're just assuming that's going to go on. They're talking about additional forests.
Okay, fair enough.
They're looking, in fact, I know that that's what they calculated, because what they did is they figured how much land will support forests. Then you subtract how many forests are already covered with that land. You subtract that land that's already forested. Then you subtract the land that's used for cities. And what you have left over... And also
farming.
0.9, and you subtract the agricultural land that's being cropped. Now, Then what you have left over is the amount that is potentially available for additional forests. and that comes to 0.9 billion hectares.
Yep.
And what I'm saying is that if you take out the Arctic tundra,
yep.
I think we can all agree it's not a good idea to plant.
Well, we can discuss that. I mean, I wouldn't rule it out.
Okay.
I don't think it's a viable prospect right now because for two reasons primarily. One is it's too cold, and again, you know, they don't seem to be paying. Well, I should read the paper more carefully. We have to pay attention to the productivity. 1,000 hectares in the equatorial tropics, where you've got decent rainfall and reasonable soils, is way more productive and will take up way more carbon dioxide than 1,000 hectares in the tundra under any circumstances.
Okay.
I mean, we don't want to be planting in the Sahara Desert, but if you could imagine reforesting in the Amazon in an area that's already been cleared, that would make a much bigger impact in terms of total carbon dioxide uptake than planting 1,000 hectares in the north of the boreal forest in Canada.
Then why don't they say in the report from the Zurich folks, why don't they say that the most important place to plant new trees would be Brazil and Indonesia and those places? No, they say the best place, almost all of the places they're planning to put these additional trees are in Russia, Canada, and the U.S. Maybe Australia, I think.
Yeah, and it's interesting that they would mention. I think part of it is about security. That these are relatively well organized states where if you establish forests, you can be reasonably confident they will be protected from all kinds of threats that local population. Well, one of the things is trees tend to get raided for firewood, especially in many of these tropical countries where people are really desperate for any kind of fuel just for cooking. But in most of the, shall we say, developed countries, if we make a commitment to grow trees to maturity, there's a much higher probability we'll succeed.
Compounding the evidence for the importance of, you know, growth in the tropical areas, or planting in the tropical areas, because of the trees grow faster, they absorb carbon dioxide sooner.
Let's not even talk about where to plant additional trees. Let's talk about the fact that according to people who live in the Arctic, trees actually are doing what the Crowther people said they would do. That is, they're coming up every place where they don't belong. The Arctic is now a place where there are lots and lots of trees. And maybe we should knock them down, because the people who live there are very convinced that is a good reason for the extremely fast rate of warming in the Arctic. The Arctic is getting hotter than any place else on Earth very quick.
Which people... Sorry, who says this? What is their justification?
I'm speaking very much of two people who write a lot, Sergei and Nikita Zimov, who live in the eastern Arctic of Siberia.
I understand.
And, they publish a lot, and they are very alarmed about the increasing temperature of the soil there, which they attribute to the growth of trees, or rather, for whatever reason, maybe the Arctic is getting warmer anyway, and which allows the trees to grow there. But they claim that the trees are making the soil get warmer.
Feedback.
Yes,
it's a positive feedback. The reality is the Arctic would be warming whether those trees were growing there or not.
Well, yes, maybe.
We know that. I mean, it's a basic first order.
Yeah.
You know, the climate models are very clear on this, and it know that we get polar amplification, and it's largely due to sea ice melting in the Arctic, particularly in the north, and that is reducing albedo and causing ocean warming, and that is contributing to the Arctic regions getting warmer more rapidly than the equatorial regions. Now, as they get warmer, they also create environments that are more conducive to growing trees. And yes, if you put trees in there, that will have a secondary effect in accelerating the changes in albedo on land. And yes, that is reckoned to cause some level of warming. And I've gone through those conversations. You know, are we talking about increasing cover with conifers, which are evergreens, and therefore basically reduce albedo year round? Or are we talking about an increasing proportion of deciduous trees, which typically colonize much more rapidly, which lose their leaves in the fall, and therefore do not have as big an impact on albedo, and which typically have a higher albedo than coniferous trees? Mm-hmm. Now, the ZMOFs are looking at a specific system, and they may well be right. And I mean, I've read this stuff about the idea that the ruminants are basically trampling down the snow and reducing the insulating capacity of the snow. Now, you know, that could work both ways, because it would also mean that more heat would actually penetrate into the permafrost under some conditions. But of course, if it also packs it down and maintains the albedo, then you're getting the reflective benefit of having the compacted snow. And yes, you know, at some scales, these processes are important. But the primary driver, the primary driver is fossil fuels and other contributions to rising CO2. The secondary driver in our case here is polar amplification, which is due primarily to sea ice melting and disappearing. And then you've got a whole bunch of consequent positive feedbacks that occur after that, and some negative feedbacks too. And what the ZMOFs have been doing, looking at, and I know they've been working in what I think is TALC, is highly organic, decomposable, organic permafrost soils, which characteristically melt and turn into this sort of soupy stuff that can actually decompose pretty rapidly. And then they would be concerned about this, because that does represent significant loss of carbon and another contribution to the atmospheric burden. But it would be, I think, a big mistake to take what they find in a specific ecosystem and say, that means we can't plant trees, or we should not have any trees in the Arctic. And the reality is that if temperatures warm, the trees will find a way to get there anyway. And we don't have to go planting them. They will gradually get there by their natural seeding.
And they are getting there.
Unless you go in there with a chainsaw and start cutting them down as soon as they appear,
mm-hmm. which they do.
Which is totally, but not on the scale of all of Siberia, and not on the scale of all of the Canadian Arctic. This would be an entirely perverse activity.
Would that process, because we're talking about succession, really,
it's a new succession,
right? So that would be, would it typically be moving slowly from the south to the north, or would you expect sort of random mass seeding that could extend very rapidly throughout the tundra because of the melting of the permafrost? Would it be very gradual, or could it be very, very fast?
I doubt it could be very fast. I mean, the general thinking about the boreal is we will lose trees at the southern edge far faster than we will gain them at the northern edge. And the biggest constraint actually on establishment of forest is the soils themselves really are not developed well enough in many parts of the Arctic, certainly in the Canadian Arctic. I'm not so sure about Siberia. I'm sure there are areas in Siberia that are much the same. They're basically skeletal soils. They're rock that was left there after the ice retreated. And it's been so cold for the last 10,000 years that really no vegetation has ever really developed. I mean, there may be little pockets here and there whereby some microclimatic fluke conditions are sufficiently good that mosses could establish, and then some herbs and shrubs, and eventually a few trees got going, and they become the seed sources to spread into other areas if conditions changed. But you can't rapidly transform all of those rocky terrain into highly productive forest soils. That would take probably thousands of years. I mean, we typically think of soil development being a really relatively slow process. And we can't plant those areas either. We could plant the organic soils And there are certainly, black spruce typically grows on organic soils or grows on sphagnum-dominated sites. And one could probably find specific individual species that would work quite well. And if we just go back to nature and see what species are the best, and black spruce and tamarack would be the obvious choices, frankly, for the far north. But it's not going to happen. It's not going to happen in the next 10 years. And naturally, it's not going to happen in 100 years because of the other constraints. Natural dispersal of conifers is really very poor because it takes at least 15, 20 years for a tree to get big enough to produce seed. And conifer seed is really quite dense, not buoyant. It doesn't spread very far. So typically, you won't see a seedling from a parent tree more than 50 meters away.
What kind of
the rate at which this regeneration cycle occurs is orders of magnitude slower than the anticipated rate of climate change that we're expecting over the next couple of 100 years. So the likelihood is that even under the most benign climatic conditions, most suitable for tree growth, it's not going to happen naturally. And I mean, okay, so maybe we could go in there and plant some areas. Absolutely. I don't think we'd be doing it in the next 10 years because we'd say it's too risky. We'd want to wait until we knew for a fact that there's a pretty good chance of establishing the plantation would actually produce trees.
I'm sorry, what would you want to plant there?
Well, I'm thinking primarily conifers. But I forgot to mention, but the other thing about this is that the deciduous species, the aspen and the birch, typically can colonize much, much faster because they have these very light wind-borne seeds. And in fact, I believe it's true to say that larch is probably more cold tolerant than most of the evergreen conifers. It may be more cold tolerant because it's deciduous. So basically any deciduous tree shuts down in the winter, whereas at some level, an evergreen tree still has to keep those needles alive, although they're probably operating at a very, very, very low rate.
I've been in touch with a forestry scientist in Britain named Ian Hartley, who mentioned a couple of things that are relevant here. He's very concerned about birch trees. I think you're right that probably you have to ask what ecosystem we're talking about. They're not all the same in the Arctic, and I think it's extremely important for us to find out more information as quickly as possible. But he says that the birch trees first, birch forests, the soils get warmer. And he said that black spruce trees have shallow roots that spread out in the active layer of the permafrost, above the permafrost, rather.
Yep, well, they can't penetrate the permafrost.
Therefore, they actually have a benign effect. They actually have a cooling effect. So, presumably, if you're going to plant anything, you'd rather have black spruce than birch trees, etc.
Well, yes and no. Because on the one hand, the albedo of black spruce is relatively low. So it will... If you think of a conifer forest and you walk into the forest, it typically feels quite cool compared to the outside air, and that's primarily because all of those layers of leaves above you are providing a lot of shade, and that shading is actually protecting the ground. And so his explanation there is that black spruce growing on top of permafrost contributes to the protection of the permafrost. Sphagnum moss is another layer of insulation. So sphagnum moss is an insulator that actually reduces heat gain by the permafrost. And then another layer of trees above that is actually protecting the whole system from getting a lot of radiation because it's absorbing it before it even hits the ground. Mm-hmm. So there's no question, and we recognize this, and if you read our paper on climate change in the boreal forest, we talk a lot about how permafrost is protected by vegetation and litter layers, and litter basically means dead sphagnum moss, and how if you end up with a fire, for example, then a lot of that material can be burned, and then once it's removed, then the permafrost is completely exposed to melting because there's nothing to shade it and there's no insulation to protect it.
What kind of a a carbon sink are the mosses and lichens and so on in the.
They are a carbon sink. It's small, and it depends. Okay, and the nice thing about the boreal or northern systems is that because they are cold, although the trees grow slowly, all of the material they produce is also decomposed very slowly. And as I said, it's rather like, the tropical system is the hare, the boreal forest is the tortoise, and the tortoise gets there in the end, and in many ways it wins. It stores far more carbon in the ground because it is so cold that the carbon in the soil does not decompose. In the tropical system, the turnover is extremely rapid because the conditions that promote rapid tree growth are also the conditions that promote rapid respiration and promote the activity of millions of different organisms, invertebrates and worms and fungi and bacteria. All these things benefit from operating at 30 degrees Celsius rather than at 5 degrees Celsius. So you get much, much more carbon accumulation in a natural boreal ecosystem. And I surmise that over time, and it does depend to some extent on how much warming the Earth experiences, but you could get to a situation in a few hundred years where in the far north, the boreal forest really has shifted there, and the carbon storage that the boreal forest provides today could be transported further north. The trouble with all of this is we're thinking about different timescales. And if you want a quick fix from growing trees, I don't think you're going to get it. But in long term, and we're talking long term meaning multiple centuries, there's quite a huge potential there.
It could be a quick fix in the tropics, some of the tropics though, right?
If the purpose is to generate a carbon sink, you're going to get far more carbon dioxide being taken up in the tropics, given current conditions, and assuming that you do something useful with the product. So you don't let the trees sit there and then die and rot. You have to harvest them and you have to turn them into long-lived wood products. Mm-hmm. Now, we like to think about the carbon benefits of forestry in Canada in the same way. We can cut down trees, turn them into 2x4s, put them into buildings, and the people who own a house or who own a desk, or even those who buy furniture from IKEA, are still somewhat invested in protecting those things. So the average lifespan of the wood stored in a house or in furniture is typically longer than the average lifespan of the wood if it had been left to rot in the forest or burn, or all the other things that can happen to dead trees, or should we say all the things that can happen to trees before they are dead and after they are dead.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and it looks to me like I want to focus on what we can do to save the world.
Yes.
It's not a joke.
Well, no, I understand that.
I'm sorry. I understand that we seriously are not kidding when we say we have to save the world. We are
with a few caveats.
A possible extinction phenomenon.
Yes.
Where, that's quite possible. Now, they tell us 10, 12 years. What can we do in that length of time? Now, you're not going to, we've got one of the things that I worry about is what the ZMOFs are worried about. You don't necessarily disagree with them, but you obviously, very few people seem to be seriously concerned about what keeps them awake at night, which is that they really believe that the trees are making things very much worse. They measure the temperature of the soil.
Yep.
They believe that the only thing to do to keep the temperature of the Arctic from getting above zero is to have things mash the snow down. And so they try to import large numbers of, experimentally, they're bringing in large numbers of big animals with the idea that in the Pleistocene period, which was about 4 degrees colder than the current period in the Arctic, that's something I read today, not in the ZMOFs, but I read someplace else. I was looking it up because you'd asked me how much colder it was. And yes, apparently it was much colder.
Right, yes.
But at any rate, the point was there were at least twice as many flesh, that is biomass, in living animals than there is on Earth today. And that's counting all the human beings on Earth.
Well, human beings don't add up to very much.
There's apparently a stupendous growth of animal life in the Arctic during the Pleistocene period.
Mm-hmm.
Huge animals, most of them are mega animals that were killed off when humans came there. They hunted them. And so these large animals would trample the snow, and they would keep the soil colder by pushing the snow down and making it compacted.
Why did they make it colder?
Argue that the only they are trying experimentally to do it on a plot of land that they own, about a large, many hundreds of acres of land, and they have measured the temperature of the soil in their land, which is covered by the biggest animals they can keep in herds there, and it is colder than adjacent land.
I believe it.
Apparently so. I wish I could find all of the citations.
I'm not disagreeing with any of this. What I'm disagreeing with is the idea that this should be a generalized prescription for the entire boreal and tundra region. It should not, and there is no reason to think. And there is no reason to think that it should be.
It isn't that it shouldn't be. It's that it's not practical to be.
There is that too, but I don't think it probably you would find that there are many areas where the same dynamics don't occur.
Then all I'm asking for is urgent research to find out where those areas are. Because if the most important thing in the world we can do right now is to plant trees and to take care of them and make sure we plant the right ones in the right place and not in the place where they're deleterious, then we have to know where to plant them. And we have to know things about the ecosystem and what happens when you compact the soil with large animals, etc. We need to know a lot of things that are treated. I'm sorry to say, the only research that I see going on is the same kind of level of urgency that has been there for the last 100 years, namely very slow. And I think we have an apparent emergency going on here. If you can tell me who's doing research that really will answer these extremely important questions of whether or not certain kinds of trees in certain kinds of environments are detrimental or are going to help cool the planet, and then they'll help us know where we plant these additional trillion trees. I don't know anybody who's doing that kind of work.
Well, no, the Canadian Forest Service is doing all this kind of work, and
I'm sorry?
The Canadian Forest Service is doing all of this kind of work. And if you want to see the collection of expertise, it's probably spread 50-50 between CFS and the forestry departments across Canada, and maybe a few in the US, and particularly in Alaska. We know the answers to most of your questions. I'm just not sure we can convince you that we can necessarily turn that information into practical programs. I mean, if Trudeau was to say, here's another $100 million, go do something, I'm sure we'd find a way of spending the money. But it's not going to solve the problem, particularly, and I think Robin agrees. We need to think about the tropics as the primary areas for growing trees, because you're going to get far more carbon dioxide taken up there per square meter, per hectare, for the investment than you're ever going to get by planting trees or not planting trees in north of tree line in Canada. And even if we were going to do that, I don't care what Bastian et al. Or Crowler et al. Say, they're not the ones working on the ground. And they don't really know the systems that we're dealing with. And I suspect that they are underestimating the extent of soils that are not suitable for growing trees in the north.
Yeah,
well, I would probably agree with that, but they're very clear that they don't see plots in the places where you want them to plant the trees, that is in the tropics. There's not a lot of space for that.
Really?
So far as the only thing they tell us where it's going to be. It's the only places to plant them, they say, are really basically in Russia, the US,
I don't think they say that.
Canada.
No, they don't say that. in fact, they're not even making a pitch for where to plant them. They're making a pitch for what the potential areas are to plant.
Yes.
And they would acknowledge that the tropics are the best place to replant now for those stocks that have been removed by people needing firewood.
Robin, you and I both have that map. I wish you had it available so you could put it on screen, because they created a map showing where they say it's possible to grow the places where they say trees can be put or will grow is primarily northern Canada, Alaska, and Siberia.
No, so here are the numbers.
All right.
Okay, here is tundra and boreal. This is it right here. Okay, that's Canada, Alaska, and Russia. The areas we're talking about. Here's tropical. Here's temperate. Here's grassland, Mediterranean, mangroves, and flooded. Okay, so the tundra and boreal combined are 225 million hectares, right? The total is 900. So that's 20%, 25%, whatever we're doing, 30%, I guess, is tundra and boreal, right? So, and not all of the boreal and taiga is unplantable. Much of it is potentially plantable. So, but they're not saying plant here, plant here. They're saying here's what's available, and these are the different zones that they exist in. So, I would bet I bet $1 that they would say plant in the best places possible first. And if there are debates like whether herds can trample down or not more than they produce methane, that would be my concern about growing massive or expanding herds into tundra areas, is that you would with methane producing 25 times the rate of having 25 times the problem as carbon dioxide does as a greenhouse gas. Methane is a big problem. I mean, a huge amount of the problem of the footprint does come from agriculture, as we know. So, I would say until that question is resolved, I would say let's not worry ourselves with that one. It may be that there's some potential there, but let's move on the tropics, because that's the biggest.
The other point about the methane is, at the time when the ice age was colder than it is now, there were twice as many large animals growing in the Arctic as there are now. And according to the ice core samples, the methane in the ice was much, much lower than it is now. Now, if you had twice as many animals excreting methane as at the present, you would certainly expect that the atmosphere would have had a lot more methane in it than it does, but it has much less. Why is that? The only explanation can have been that there are, in fact, bacteria that consume methane, and they live in the soil. There's research going on about them. Methyl gorgona. It's named after the Gorgon medusa. The particular bacterium that consumes methane is one of the few things ever discovered that is possible to break apart the methane hydrogen, methane molecule, and presumably, not presumably, I don't know, maybe I'm the only person who's presuming this in the world, but my theory, based on no grounds whatever, is that there must have been a hell of a lot of that Gorgon bacteria in the soil of the Arctic at the time when those big animals were there, or otherwise the ice cores would show that the methane levels were 2 or 3 or 4 times higher than they seem to have actually been. Now, I don't know whether you're going to be able to raise a lot of those Gorgon bacteria, but that would have to be the only explanation I can think of as a way to counteract the, what are you doing? There you go. Here we are. Which one is this?
So this is the best.
Is this the current? This is the current one.
Yeah, but this the chart that I showed is based on this map.
Right, right.
It's exactly the same thing. So in this area, can you see my pointer here?
Oh, yes.
Yeah, so this whole area here, the gray, is unplantable, okay? So, yeah, and the yellow is, what, how does this go here?
Well, it evidently shows low tree cover. So
Right,
relatively sparse tree cover.
Right. And
which is what you'd expect.
So that's consistent. So here we go, and a problem area. I'm not quite. This is areas that are already planted or unplantable. I guess that's what
this map
amounts to. Yes,
excludes existing forests, urban areas, and agricultural lands.
Right.
So you can't plant in the Sahara. You can't plant in the rainforest of Brazil because it's already there.
Right.
And how can you plant in the rainforest of Eastern Australia?
Well, I don't know, but they've got it yellow.
Or Madagascar, where I mean, Madagascar, I think deforestation's been terrible, but there's certainly lots of tree cover on the east coast of Australia.
How come the Philippines and Malaysia and those areas are
considered unplantable?
Are black?
Unplantable.
Why can't they grow trees there?
It may be that they're considered to be agricultural. They've been cleared for agriculture.
I have two requests. One is that we either do more research, because I can't find it, or if it's being done, that we publicize it and let people know about it. Because the answers to some of these questions about what the effect of various kinds of trees is on the permafrost, and how much we can expect to run away, when we get to a certain tipping point, it warms it, which warms it some more, which warms it some more, etc. So we have a vicious cycle. And when do we get to that point, and how much risk is there of having methane emissions from the melting permafrost reach that point within a few years? And if so, what in the hell do we do now to try to prevent it? I think we need urgent answers to those questions, and I don't see the answers in anything that I've been able to find. It's not very clear.
Have you looked at any of the model results? I mean, there must be at least 4 or 5 modeling studies of the methane question for permafrost melting that have been done in the last 10 years. And I'm thinking of there's Schaefer's, and I can't remember all the names. I've got 3 of them cited in the paper that I produced with my team, and there are at least 2 or 3 others I've seen since. And the interesting thing about those is they all project that the methane release is going to occur, the major methane release is going to occur sometime next century. It's not imminent. I mean, imminent in a sort of geologic sense, but not in a human sense. Which isn't to say we shouldn't be concerned about it. It's just saying that we do have some time to avert that problem.
Well, that's what I was reading a year ago, but I do not read that anymore.
Well, who are you reading it from?
At least once a week, I come across an article saying, "Oh, it's a lot faster than we thought it was going to be." Watch out.
I saw that was the Natali et al. Was that one of them?
I'm sorry?
Natali et al. Is that one of the ones?
I don't remember. But these are not just a few studies. It's coming at me from every direction, and
I don't think it's all about methane release from the Arctic or from the
Well, I talked to Adele Buckley today, who studies the Arctic more than anybody else I know, and she's as frightened as I am about the prospects, because she keeps coming across very urgent pieces of information saying that we don't have much time and it's happening fast. So
I agree. We don't have much time.
Then what do we do? What do we do? We can't just let's turn out the lights and ride bicycles to work. I'm sorry. The time is gone for that kind of solution. That's fine. We do that, and we have to do a lot more than that. And they say planting trees is the best thing to do. I'm all for planting 1 trillion trees. In fact, I'd like to plant 5 trillion trees, because I think 4 of the trillion are going to die anyway.
Well,
and we
yeah,
have to plant about 5.
but I think that's what it means. When they say plant 1 trillion, it really means plant 2 trillion and expect 1 trillion to survive.
Well, a trillion is 1,000 billion. So when Justin Trudeau says, oh, look, guys, we're going to plant 2 billion trees, whoop-de-doo. I mean...
Yeah, but over what time period?
I don't even know. It doesn't make any difference. 2 billion out of 1,000 is not very much.
Yeah, but the other countries have a role to play as well. And in many ways...
There are 190 countries in the world.
Not all of them have big forest areas.
All right, but it doesn't matter. If every one of them planted 2 billion trees, we would only be a third of the way there.
Fair point.
So we've got to do a lot more than planting trees, or at least if we plant the trees, we better do a good job of it and know what we're doing. And actually, I don't think we know what we're doing.
Well, no, we probably know more than I think you realize. But, I mean, some of these are tricky problems. What Canada could do, actually, if we were thinking about a policy perspective on this, is provide support to tropical countries to invest in planting more trees in the tropics. And of course, other countries have actually done this. In the joint development mechanisms that were part of the IPCC process some time ago. So Norway in particular, I think, was supporting major planting in places like Indonesia. Because where the big areas of forest land that have been deforested and which could potentially carry more trees are mainly in the tropics. And we would get far more benefit from growing those trees and knowing that they are being protected.
You put the money where it does the most impact, and it's in the tropical rainforest for now. And it does not mean that's all you do. It just means let's do at least that now, because we could. And that could be something Canada could bring up at the UN.
I have 2 other suggestions. One is that the Zurich guys subtracted from the total available land the land that's used for crops and the land that's used for cities. Now, cities, believe it or not, have quite a lot of land used for lawns and things of that kind. Turns out I believe I read that there's as much land in the U.S. used for lawns as is allocated to the 4 most the 4 biggest crops in the world in the U.S. And therefore, if we just took up people's land out of the front yard and planted forests, extremely dense forests, where people at least are very close to them and they can take care of them and water them and weed them and nurture them so they don't all die, that would give us some compensation for the fact that we definitely should not be planting them in the Arctic, so far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, well, with a whole bunch of concerns there. But I mean, maybe a better strategy would be to persuade the people who own the lawns to start growing their own vegetables on those lawns and start turning cropland that is being used to produce crops 1,000 miles away to be growing trees, so that you reduce the carbon footprint in doing the transportation of those crops, and you make that food production a local investment. Basically the homeowner becomes responsible for growing at least some of the food they eat every year, which has numerous advantages, one of which is that you can be pretty sure the roots won't be undermining the foundations of your house. But all the benefits of locally grown, locally sourced food, knowing you didn't use any fertilizer or any pesticides or whatever the concerns that you have. Too many people just don't want to go there and do that.
Well, the laws
because you don't really want to be growing large trees in urban environments everywhere. I mean, all the parks and places, absolutely, you do this. And there are a lot of trees growing in urban environments. We call it the urban forest. But in total biomass terms, it's pretty insignificant compared to what you could achieve if you started to plant marginal cropland. You would obviously keep the best cropland for growing crops, but some of it maybe not so good, so you would turn it over to trees. And the other thing we definitely can do, humans will need to do, I suspect, is to stop eating meat, or at least cut down their meat production, meat consumption, which will reduce all kinds of benefits in terms of reduced emissions and probably greater public health, and allow you to feed many, many more people on much less land. So you could have the other land.
That is certainly the mantra. That's absolutely the mantra that almost all environmentalists have today, to eat less meat. I certainly don't believe a word of it. I believe, because I think that regenerative agriculture is just about as important as reforestation.
Oh, that may be true too.
And the use of livestock as a means of reversing the degradation of the soil is, I think, being established. It's certainly not well established yet. It's controversial yet, but as I read it, there's something to take seriously there about it.
You're going to get as much benefit.
You don't raise agriculture, you don't raise livestock unless you intend to eat them.
Well, totally. And I would say you don't grow trees unless you intend to harvest them. It's the same thing. Having said that, I think there's no question that we could reduce, human consumption of meat could be reduced by 50% or 75%, which would have huge impact on the amount of land available for growing crops and trees, because typically speaking, you need 10 times the land base to grow the same amount of meat that you would as you would need to grow the plant equivalent protein content. And there's very little evidence that says we can't survive without eating meat, but I'm not saying we should stop it altogether.
Okay.
I'm just saying that it is a strategy that could actually go a long way to addressing some of these concerns about finding a land base on which to grow trees.
Next,
and it could reduce the carbon footprints associated with crop production.
One of the next talk shows I want to do has to do with regenerative agriculture, and that will come up there. And believe me, it's as controversial among people who are into regenerative farming as it is right here between us. So this not going to be solved. That one is not going to be solved today about whether to eat meat and raise livestock.
But I guess the other issue here is that I talk about the carbon footprint. What really bugs me is that we go to the supermarket, in Edmonton, and we buy packaged lettuce or assorted salad stuff, packaged in plastic, grown in a greenhouse near Los Angeles. Mm-hmm. It has been shipped up on a plane. Never mind the environmental impact of growing it in a greenhouse in California. It's shipped here on a plane so we can have it fresh, when at least theoretically we could be growing it in a greenhouse probably next door, if we put our mind to it. And create jobs in the process.
The other calculation, I'm just looking it up as we're talking here, of the production of methane by cows.
Yes.
Cow emissions, believe it or not, are more damaging to the planet than CO2 from cars.
According to some calculations.
Right. So livestock are responsible for 18% of the greenhouse gases that cause global warming, more than cars, planes, and all other forms of transport put together.
Turns out that seaweed, a small amount of seaweed, if you feed it to the cows, it reduces their methane production by 80%. You can also reduce it by vaccines. I'm not sure I want to have my cows vaccinated, but there you go. Anyway, we've gone 20 minutes over time, and that's great. David, what do you say to the world? How are you going to save us?
I think we have to recognize that wood is a valuable resource for a number of reasons. And it is partly that if we want to use forests in any way to store carbon, we have to stop thinking that the best way to do this is to preserve old growth forests and let them sort of close the gate on them and say, that's a carbon sink, because it's not a carbon sink. It's a carbon store, and it's a very vulnerable carbon store. But if we actively manage our forests with the intention of harvesting a significant portion of the biomass that they sequester when carbon dioxide is taken up, and turn that into long-lived wood products, which ultimately humans are responsible for protecting, we will have a bigger carbon sink in global forests. This is as true in the tropics as it is true in the boreal as well as the temperate regions. And in addition to that, we have to recognize that wood as a construction material displaces highly energy intensive materials like steel and concrete and plastics. It's a renewable resource. The key is that we have to manage those forests in a sustainable way, and maybe have to invest more effort in research and development of sustainable forestry practices in order to meet those objectives and manage carbon at the same time.
Sounds good to me. Very good. Thank you. Robin, what do you have to say to the world?
Well, it's hard to beat that package. Let me just add a couple of points. As an environmentalist, I think we do have to save some old growth.
Absolutely.
Right.
Oh no, let me finish.
Right. No, I know you weren't saying the opposite, but I think we have to decide how much is going to be forest for production of wood, and that we should learn when best to cut it so it's at the most efficient moment. It should be replanted. We should be planting more where it's safe to plant, and we should be focusing on the areas of the globe that give us the biggest bang for the buck, like in the tropical areas. And tree planting is not the only piece of the puzzle.
And the second point is, absolutely, I agree with Robin. There are many reasons why we may want to preserve old growth forest. I'm just saying that carbon sequestration is not one of them.
All right. Very good. Thank you both.
Thank you.
See you again.
Nice
Bye.
talking to you, David.
It's been great fun.
This conversation is one of the weekly series Talk About Saving the World, produced by Peace Magazine and Project Save the World. Please visit our website at tosavetheworld.ca, where you can sign the Platform for Survival, a list of 25 public policy proposals that, if enacted, would greatly reduce the risk of 6 global threats to humankind. Come back next week for another discussion of a serious global issue.